At the start of World War II, both Japan and Germany did not have the kind of access to oil as the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom. So Japan was eyeing the British East Indies to gain access to this natural resource, and Germany was eyeing the vast oil fields of Baku in Russia. To clear its decks to invade the British East Indies, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor to disable the US Navy, and Germany embarked on a blitzkrieg to capture regions of Western Europe and finally invade Russia. Welcome to the Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we trace the fortunes of Germany and Japan through World War II as they try to gain access to the valuable resource of oil to defeat the combined Allied forces. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese started closing in on the British East Indies, essentially the oil wells in Balikpapan in Borneo. And in anticipation of the impending Japanese attack on Balikpapan, the oil crew started destroying the oil fields using the explosive TNT. Yes, Saddam Hussein wasn't the first guy to set fire to the oil fields. So the entire oil infrastructure that had been set up in Borneo for about 4 decades was destroyed in less than a day. However, the attempt to deny Japan the oil in the East Indies was only an initial setback. Within a short period, Japan was able to restore the Balikpapan oil fields, and they even exceeded their own goals. By mid-March 1942, Japan's control of the East Indies was complete, and by early 1943, the oil production was at 75% of the 1940 level from the British East Indies. So Japan's oil problem, which was an initial paranoia at the start of World War II, seemed to have been solved. And with its oil infrastructure fairly secure, Japan could have actually started moving towards the west, towards the Middle East and Russia, and cut off the Allies' supply of oil from Baku and Iran. Japan instead decided to mount an attack on Midway Island, which was in the Pacific about 1,100 miles west of Hawaii. Now, the rationale here was expanding its defense perimeter, which means if Japan could get Americans off of the Midway Island, all of Pacific was pretty much Japan's. But the Americans were superior with respect to both technology as well as organizational ability. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a surprise attack, but this time the Americans were prepared. And this ultimately ended up being a decisive turning point in the war in the Pacific. Japan had totally underestimated American submarines, as well as the technology and the precision of the torpedoes that these submarines carried. Suddenly, Japan's losses were significant, and Americans were specifically targeting Japan's oil infrastructure, that is, the oil tankers. And all of a sudden, Japan began to feel the shortage of the liquid fuel. Oil imports had risen to their peak in the first quarter of 1943 for Japan, but they were about half that at the same time in the year 1944. So the fuel that Japan needed desperately during the war had suddenly started dwindling. Meanwhile, on the Western Front, Germany had invaded Poland in 1939 and was undertaking a blitzkrieg and moving fast towards the oil fields of Baku in Russia. When Churchill became Prime Minister of Britain in 1940, about more than 85% of Britain's domestic refining market was served by three Western companies, Royal Dutch Shell, Anglo-Iranian, and Standard Oil of New Jersey. So Britain was not too concerned about the supply of oil during the course of the war. But Royal Dutch Shell had caused some sleepless nights to Britain during the mid-1930s. Henry Detterding, the chairman, had become a Nazi sympathizer, and he had started having discussions with the German government about Shell providing oil to Germany. This had caused a lot of angst, and Detterding, though, slowly lost control of the group and retired by the end of 1936, and his stock was mostly distributed among British holders. So ultimately, by the start of World War II, the supply of oil to Britain was without any risks or concerns. So while Germany was in a blitzkrieg mode, its primary target from an enemy perspective were the oil tankers that were moving from the United States to Britain. And within the first 3 months of 1942, almost 4 times the numbers of tankers built were sunk by German U-boats in the Atlantic. U-boat was the term used by Germans for submarines. So a solution had to be found for this problem, and the answer was provided by the United States in the Big Inch. The Big Inch was a 1,254 miles long crude oil pipeline which was carrying oil from Texas to the East Coast and was initiated in August of 1942. And along with it, between April 1943 and March 1944, the Little Inch was built, which was a 1,475 mile long pipeline that was transporting refined products from the southwest to the east coast. So by the end of 1944, about 42% of oil was transported to the east coast through pipelines, compared to just about 4% at the beginning of 1942. And also, in parallel, by May of 1943, the threat from the German U-boats had mostly been overcome, with the Americans being able to break through the U-boat codes, as well as maintaining a convoy system, which was a group of ships that would be protecting the tankers from attack. So between the Big Inch, the Little Inch, and the defenses against German U-boats, by 1943-44, the threat to oil for the Allies had virtually been shaken off. Between December of 1941 and August of 1945, the Allies consumed about 7 billion barrels of oil, 6 billion of which came from the United States. Around early 1943, the Germans were engaged in a bitter fight in Stalingrad in Russia, which is now Volgograd. German Field Marshal Manstein begged Hitler to send forces in the Caucasus to help at Stalingrad, but Hitler refused and said, unless we get the Baku oil, the war is lost. So by the beginning of February 1943, the Germans, who had been completely encircled by the Russians, who had cut off their fuel lines, ultimately surrendered. And that was the first major defeat of Germany in Europe. And this ended up being a huge turning point in the war in Europe. Moving on to the Pacific, the Allied submarines had tightened the blockade around the fuel supply for Japan, and Japan was feeling the crunch of the shortage of liquid fuel. The Americans, having full access to their oil resources, were able to put forth a devastating combination of amphibious warfare and carrier air power. And this was something that Japan could not match based on its resources. And in October 1944, after a devastating defeat at the hands of the Americans following a 3-day battle near the Philippines, the level of desperation grew higher among the Japanese. And this desperation led to a new weapon introduced by Japan: kamikaze, or suicide pilots. Since they were short on oil, the kamikaze pilots were given only half the oil required, and they were expected to crash their planes into American ships while saving fuel for the return trip. Send planes on a suicide mission so you can save half the fuel. The Americans, meanwhile, had an abundant supply of oil. In fact, in 1944, Guam became a major American base for bombing Japan, and it provided about 120,000 barrels per day of aviation fuel. So just from one location alone, Americans were using 6 times as much oil as the Japanese. The Japanese, though, refused to give up, and in growing desperation for fuel, launched the Pine Root Campaign, where pine roots were dug up, heated for 12 hours to produce a crude oil substitute. But this process was very resource intensive, and by June 1945, pine roots were producing about 75,000 barrels per month of fuel, as opposed to a 12,000 barrels per day target. In spring of 1945, a new government under Admiral Kantaro Suzuki came to power in Japan, and it undertook a survey to see how prepared was Japan to continue the war. And by mid-June 1945, the message was clear: Japan was out of oil. But Japan still refused to surrender, and on August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and subsequently on August 8, the USSR declared war against Japan by attacking Manchuria. And at this point, on August 10, Japan's Emperor Hirohito relayed Japan's surrender to the United States. And on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito went on national radio to announce the Japanese surrender to his people. In his message, he said, "We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable." General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan on August 30 to sign the surrender document. General Hideki Tojo, the wartime prime minister, shot himself when the Americans tried to arrest him, but he was rushed to a hospital and he survived the self-inflicted shot, only within the next year to be put on trial for war crimes, found guilty, and executed. Meanwhile, going back to Germany, who had just been handed a sounding defeat in February of 1943 by Russia, to make matters worse, the Allies also invaded Morocco and Algeria, and eventually the Germans surrendered along with the Italian troops in North Africa in May of 1943. One of the core reasons for the turnaround was the Allied attacks on German fuel supply. Hitler's General Rommel himself stated, "The bravest men can do nothing without guns. The guns nothing without plenty of ammunition. And neither guns nor ammunition are of much use in mobile warfare unless there are vehicles with sufficient petrol to haul them around." With German defeat in North Africa and Russia by mid-1943, Hitler's dream of taking over the Baku oil field in Russia was pretty much over. Now, Germany was facing a huge fuel crisis and had to turn over to the coal-based synthetic oil production. By the first quarter of 1944, the synthetic fuel plants were providing 57% of the total supply for Germany and 92% of the supply of aviation gasoline. Now, the synthetic fuel oil industry was very labor-centric. So where were the Germans getting the labor from? By 1944, slave labor made up 1/3 of the total workforce in the German synthetic fuels industry. Slave labor? What was that? The synthetic fuel and rubber plants, which were key to the war effort, were placed adjacent to the Auschwitz concentration camp in Poland. IG Farben, which was the company manufacturing the synthetic fuel oil, had built its own branch concentration camp, Monowitz, because too many prisoners were dying at the other camps. Monowitz was a death camp and a factory providing slave labor for the production of synthetic fuel. The Allies now had a new target, the bombing of German synthetic fuels industry, and from May 1944 onwards, many factories across Germany, including the IG Farben plant in Luna, were bombed. And by September of 1944, after the Allies had been victorious in the D-Day landings in Normandy, the synthetic fuel production had dropped from 92,000 barrels per day to a mere 5,000 barrels per day. By now, Germany was out of oil, and even when it tried to launch a counteroffensive, like in the Battle of the Bulge, it really did not have enough oil resources to sustain it. General Rommel was forced to commit suicide after Hitler suspected him of an assassination attempt on his life post the Normandy invasion. By February of 1945, German production of aviation fuel was down to a mere 0.5% of what it had been during the first few months of 1944. So much so that the German army trucks had to be pulled by oxen. Not fuel, but by oxen. And just like Japan, Hitler hoped for some magical deliverance. And it was not until the Russians were right on top of his underground bunker that he committed suicide, with instructions to pour gasoline and burn his body. But this happened after 35 million people had died. Before I conclude this section, I would like to acknowledge The Prize by Daniel Yergin, one of the finest books on history of petroleum that I've read. Definitely a great resource to get more insight into the history of this major asset of the 20th century. And now, on to the quiz section of the program. Our last week's question was, who is the top oil producing country in the world today? A. Saudi Arabia, B. Russia, C. Canada, or D. the US? In 2012, the US overtook Russia for the number 2 spot and then surpassed the former leader Saudi Arabia in 2013 to become the world's top oil producer. Much of the increased US production is attributable to fracking in the shale formations in Texas and North Dakota. and the US has been a net exporter of oil since early 2011. So the answer is D, the US. On to the question for this episode. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, was founded in September of 1960, and the 5 founding members included 4 oil-producing nations from the Middle East, namely Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. Which one was the 5th member? Was it A, Indonesia, B, United States, C, Venezuela, or D, Russia? Once again, who was the 5th founding member nation of the OPEC besides Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia? A, Indonesia, B, United States, C, Venezuela, or D, Russia? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in this episode. In the next episode, we travel east to China and trace the developments there post World War II. Till then, stay safe, but keep exploring the why in history.